Now, Donald Trump has pushed back a July 9th deadline for most countries to secure trade deals with the United States of the 1st of August. But the US president suggested that deadline is not 100% firm, adding he would consider extensions if countries made proposals. Trump still has outstanding differences on trade with the European Union. The bloc is facing a current baseline tariff of 10%, but is hoping for possible exemptions. For more on all of this, we can bring in our European Affairs editor, Armen Georgian. Armen, great to see you. How are the negotiations going?
Well, they've been very intense, especially in the last few weeks, Delano. The bottom line is it looks as if the two sides will keep negotiating beyond the July 9th deadline. The next deadline is August the 1st, and if there is no deal at that point, then the EU could see tariffs of 50% applied by the US across the board to European products. I suspect, though, given how intense these diplomatic talks have been recently, I think it would be reasonable to expect that the EU will be able to work something out. Of course, you never know with Trump, but it seems reasonable to expect that the EU will be able to lock in this current 10% that you mentioned, this 10% baseline tariff that the US is currently imposing on the EU beyond August the 1st then. But of course, as you also said, Delano, it's trying to get some exemptions on certain products, perhaps alcohol, wine and spirits, cosmetics, aircraft parts, things like that.
So if we go ahead and have these exemptions, could that potentially create discord within EU members?
For sure, because EU members have different industrial priorities, of course. But I think it's important to mention, Delano, that the current US tariffs regime has already created discord over the last few months in the EU. You've got the French, for example, who keep saying that the current asymmetrical situation is not acceptable. What they mean by asymmetrical is that when the US imposed this 10% baseline tariff, the EU didn't retaliate in order to give space to negotiations, and that over time that becomes basically a permanent situation. The French don't want that. Meanwhile, recently the Italian Prime Minister said actually keeping in this 10% asymmetrical situation would not affect Italy that much. And at the same time, you've got the German Chancellor, of course, where the car industry is very important. He wants a quick deal because remember that the current Trump tariffs regime already has a 25% tariff on European cars, which really affects the Germans. So you've already got differences between the EU member states. I recently talked to the French or the Minister Delegate for Europe, Benjamin Haddad, about all of this. Let's take a listen to him now.
Right now, we have a situation where you have 10% tariff on European goods, 25% on steel and aluminum. It's not acceptable. It cannot be accepted as a sort of new normal of the trade relationship. So let's have a negotiation. Let's have a solution that allows us to go back to what was the situation before, and trade between the United States and Europe. It's in everyone's interest. But we have instruments, once again, to be able to defend collectively our interest, and I heard this from the President of the European Commission.
Basically, Delano, he's saying we should go back to 0 for 0 tariffs and not have this situation which eventually becomes permanent, where you've got 10% rate coming in from the US and or even other rates, and the EU doesn't retaliate. We should go back to 0 for 0. As I understand it, there are other countries as well as France pushing against this new normal, right, that the French don't want. That would be Portugal, Sweden and Luxembourg. The problem for those countries is that you've got other EU member states that are now, as I understand it, are becoming more resigned to keeping this asymmetrical situation, this unequal situation, because for them the alternative could be even worse. If we end up with even higher tariffs on EU products, that would be even worse. So that they seem to be open to keeping this sort of asymmetrical, unfair, if you will, unequal situation, but then bringing in a few exemptions to try and kind of smooth over the rough edges. But to come back to what we said at the start, you never know with Trump, right?
It's very confusing.
Yeah, because he said in his letter to the South Koreans, for example, this is still subject to change. This could still change. So you never really know with him. But negotiations will be going on again beyond July 9th.
And that August 1st deadline could potentially be pushed back.
Exactly.
So it's very, very confusing.
It's very confusing. It could go on beyond August the 1st, and meanwhile, we would have this locked-in 10%, which, as I said, France and a few other countries don't want that to become a permanent fixture.